Hello and welcome back to part 6 of my Resident Evil retrospective series. Today we're going to be looking at Resident Evil 0, a prequel to the original game focusing on the exploits of the ill-fated STARS Bravo team. As I mentioned in my previous video, Capcom released 2 Resident Evil titles for the Nintendo Gamecube in 2002. The first was a remake of the original, featuring improved graphics, new locations and enemies, and expanded gameplay mechanics. The second was Resident Evil 0, which was set just one day before the events of the first game. Because the two games were released in the same year, used the same game engine and revolved around similar events, it would be easy to assume they'd been developed in tandem as part of a larger strategic plan on Capcom's part. Nope. The reality is that Resident Evil 0 has probably the longest and most difficult development cycle of any game in the series, so let's get into it. The idea for a prequel first came up back in 1996 while the original Resident Evil was still in development. Capcom were interested in using the 64DD attachment for the Nintendo 64. Remember that thing? Didn't think so. The DD was repeatedly delayed before finally trickling out onto the market in 1999. Needless to say, consumers weren't impressed and it sold barely 15,000 units before Nintendo pulled the plug. Since the DD was a non-starter, Capcom were forced to build their game on the N64's cartridge interface instead. Cartridges do have a few advantages over CDs, namely the lack of load times. Unfortunately, the downside is very limited storage space. N64 cartridges could hold about 10% as much data as the CD, which is bad news for a data-heavy game like Resident Evil. Still, Capcom were adamant that they wanted a game on Nintendo's console, so cartridge it would have to be. With the decision made to develop on the N64, production kicked off in late 1998. The game's story and script were finished early the following year, and Resident Evil 0 was officially announced by Capcom. This early prototype of Resident Evil 0 was designed to be more difficult than its predecessors, removing the now standard item boxes to make 0 more like Sweet Home, the game that had inspired the entire Resident Evil series in the first place. Instead, items could simply be dropped whenever you wanted and retrieved later. The game would feature 2 playable characters, Rebecca Chambers, the only surviving member of Bravo team, and Billy Cohen, an escaped convict with a dark past. The game would feature a partner zapping system, allowing you to switch instantly from one character to the other during gameplay. This system would take advantage of the N64's lack of load times, theoretically giving players the ability to move from one end of the game map to the other in a matter of seconds. In an effort to make combat more intense, Capcom experimented with giving zombies different reactions when shot and allowing the player to counter-attack when bitten. The team also toyed with the idea of faster and more powerful zombies, an idea that would eventually morph into Resident Evil's Crimson Heads. Development proceeded throughout 1999 and a playable demo of 0 was released at the Tokyo Game Show in early 2000. The game was expected to release in July of that year and reportedly had an atmosphere similar to the first Resident Evil, focusing more on suspense and problem solving than action and combat. Looking at it now, you can certainly see the similarities with the first game. However, development began to slow down as the N64's lack of storage space began to bite. The team tried all manner of technical tricks and workarounds to reduce the game's size, but there was just no getting around the fact that a Resident Evil game wasn't going to fit on a 64 meg cartridge. With no clear way forward, production on Resident Evil 0 ground to a halt. Fortunately, a solution came along the following year in the form of the Gamecube. Nintendo had finally learned from their past mistakes and made the leap to optical discs, allowing Capcom the storage space they needed to properly develop their long-awaited game. Production was quickly restarted and shifted to the newly announced Gamecube. The story, setting and characters were all ported over, but everything else had to be rebuilt from scratch on the new system. To save time, the game engine from Resident Evil Remake was repurposed to suit Zero's requirements. More FMV sequences were created to take advantage of the extra storage space, and all the voice acting was re-recorded. The script was also updated. In the prototype story, either Rebecca or Billy would die partway through, with the other surviving character completing the game. The idea was scrapped since Rebecca dying wouldn't make much sense as she's clearly alive during the events of Resident Evil. Billy was originally designed to be a more ambiguous character, possibly becoming a friend or enemy due to player choices during the game, but this was again scrapped and he was made more heroic and compassionate. The GameCube's use of optical discs reintroduced load times, so the development team had to use a few programming cheats to make the partner zapping system work. With these gameplay elements decided and the final coding complete, Resident Evil 0 finally launched in November 2002, more than 6 years after it was originally thought up. But is it any good? Well, the best answer I can give is kind of. Set the day before the events of the mansion incident, Zero follows the adventures of STARS rookie Rebecca Chambers and her Bravo team comrades. You know the story well enough by now. A recent spate of murders in the Raccoon City area has led the team to the nearby mountains in search of the culprits, when their helicopter suffers engine failure and crash lands. Moving off to investigate a nearby train that seems to have stopped dead in the middle of the woods, it's not long before Rebecca realises all is not well with the train's passengers. Trying to fight her way out, she encounters Billy Cohen, an escaped prisoner. Cut off from her team, she is reluctantly forced to team up with Billy in order to stay alive and find a means of escape. Soon the train's off and moving again. The Special Forces operatives assigned to clean up the mess are attacked and killed by mutated leeches, and Rebecca and Billy have to work together to avoid the same fate. Together the pair delve deeper into the mysteries surrounding the T-virus outbreak that's turning everyone into zombies and mutated monsters, the origins of the sinister Umbrella Corporation, and the identity of the mysterious man who seems to be behind the whole thing. That's the plot, such as it is. Needless to say, the game has a good crack at trying to tie its story into the rest of the Resident Evil canon, even if it all feels a bit clunky and shoehorned at times. Albert Wesker and William Birkin show up in a few cutscenes, for no other reason than to have familiar faces on display. The main antagonist, James Marcus, who's never been mentioned until now, feels exactly what he is, a disposable bad guy who shows up when he needs to, spouts some generic lines about revenge and power, and dies when the game calls for it. It's weird how Resident Evil games around this time were so preoccupied with animals. Code Veronica was all about bees, whereas the object of Zero's obsession is leeches. Everywhere you look there's leeches. The intro, the enemies, the boss battles. To be fair, the shape-shifting leech monsters are a novel concept, and they're pretty intimidating to fight, just a big mass of horrifyingly deformed animals congealed together into a vaguely human shape. It's a bit like your average nightclub in Glasgow. Zero uses the same game engine as the Resident Evil remake, so the graphics obviously look good. The pre-render backgrounds are sharp, detailed and imaginative, with some welcome FMV animation that helps set the scene but never becomes distracting, and the character models are well realised and expressive. The soundtrack is moody and evocative, and the voice acting, while not exactly Oscar-worthy, at least gives the characters a bit of personality, and it seems like everyone's making the effort. Speaking of characters, Zero makes a few questionable choices. Rebecca Chambers, propelled into the limelight for her first solo outing, seems to have grown a new set of balls from somewhere. Instead of the frightened, indecisive young rookie we see in Resident Evil, she's now a tough and determined soldier ready to risk her life in the pursuit of duty. Although I guess it's necessary to make her work as the protagonist of Zero, such a change of personality doesn't gel well with the larger series canon, especially considering she goes from this to this.
What? Oh! Oh no!
In the space of a single day. Anyway, let's talk about her co-star Billy, an outwardly hostile but troubled ex-soldier accused of a crime he didn't commit. As far as backstories go, this one's straight off the stock anti-hero production line. He talks a good game, but there's really not much to the guy beyond some nifty tattoos that probably looked really cool 15 years ago. Naturally, he's not very trusting of Rebecca, but she can't afford to leave him behind. In this way, Zero becomes less of a survival horror game and more of a buddy movie, with both parties initially hostile and trading barbed insults, but gradually growing closer through their shared experiences until they develop a real bond by the time the climactic battle rolls around. Yeah, it's the same story we've seen a million times before. Lastly, James Marcus, the antagonist of the story. I don't know what they were thinking with this guy. With his leather trench coat and his long white hair, he looks more like a reject from a Final Fantasy developer's notes than a genuine villain in a supposedly grounded and realistic series. Albert Wesker is also there pulling strings behind the scenes, but his presence is more fan service than a genuine contribution to the plot. He never gets involved, and we knew he wouldn't. The other thing that I always found weird about this game is the lack of Bravo team members. Yeah, they appear at the beginning, and once or twice the characters will pop up during the story, but really you don't see much of them throughout Resident Evil Zero, and that's what I thought the game was going to be about. In terms of gameplay, mechanics and style, Zero initially plays much like any other Resident Evil game. You investigate new areas, solve puzzles, shoot zombies and other nasties, manage your limited stock of weapons and ammo, and make occasional choices to advance the plot. All well and good. Then you join forces with Billy and everything changes, and not for the better. The core of Resident Evil's gameplay has always been the theme of isolation. It's just you, the player, alone and vulnerable, trapped in a hostile environment, surrounded by lurking monstrosities that want to kill you. It's scary because there's nobody there to watch your back, nobody to add their firepower to yours, nobody to provide the reassuring presence of another human being when you have to venture into a darkened basement with only a knife to defend yourself. By introducing the partner zapping system, this feeling of isolation and paranoia is completely removed. Billy is almost always there to carry extra items, provide extra firepower, and just generally help out when things get tough. Yeah, you can leave a partner behind, but sooner or later they'll come under attack and they're usually too dumb to defend themselves properly, so you end up having to jump back into them and take control, leaving the other character vulnerable. Most of the time, the biggest threat to your survival is the system's own weak AI. There's the odd stretch where the game arbitrarily separates you, and some of the old sense of urgency returns, but such moments are too few and far between in Zero. Puzzles are naturally based around this two-person system, so you have to learn to switch rapidly between characters and master the rudimentary order system to make them work. The game at least does its best to compensate for the increased help offered by your partner. Enemies can usually come at you from multiple directions, preventing you from concentrating your firepower and funneling them into choke points. Instead, you have to learn the art of run and gun, finding the optimal position to give both characters a decent field of fire. Another controversial decision is the removal of the inventory chests. Items can now simply be dropped if you no longer have space to carry them. In theory, this should make Zero a more realistic gaming experience and force you to make tough choices about what to carry, but in practice the new system just means inventory management is even more of a pain in the arse than before, especially when you realise you've left a key item on the other side of the map and you'll have to venture back through a dozen zombie infested corridors to retrieve it. So what the hell am I trying to say here? Well, I guess my point is that you can have too much of a good thing. For fans of the series, Zero effectively provides more of what they like. It's a solid and competent but underwhelming entry into the series that's forever destined to be overshadowed by its bigger brothers. It makes some effort to try new things, but ultimately the things it does aren't really worth doing, and in the end it feels like a story that didn't really need to be told. I won't tell you to avoid it, because it's still entertaining, and if you want the full Resident Evil experience, then it's definitely worth playing, but it's not a game that's likely to stay with you for long. That being said, it does kind of represent the end of an era as far as the Resident Evil series goes. Zero would be the last game to make use of traditional pre-rendered backgrounds that had been the series' hallmark since 1996, and although there would certainly be more titles to come, some good and some not so much, one way or another it would never be quite the same after this. So I suppose in the end, Resident Evil Zero can be seen as the last stand for traditional survival horror fans. It might not exactly be the glorious send-off the series deserved, but it does at least deserve its place in Resident Evil history. And that concludes part 6 of my Resident Evil retrospective. As always, I hope you've enjoyed this series so far. If so, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and join me in part 7 where we'll look at the game that changed the series forever, Resident Evil 4.